years ago, I was stunned in making a discovery. The year was 1999, and the day was February 8. When I make a crucial discovery, I usually enter a note into a calendar file on my computer, and this file serves as a sporadic diary. I'd like to read excerpts from my notes for that day. These are the notes that I made after discovering the proof that the idea of dichotomous afterlife, heaven versus hell, is irrational. I covered this proof in the video on heaven and hell, which you'll want to view first so that you understand the notes, which I'll now read. This morning after awakening about 10 o'clock, my mind was filled with ideas about the logic of punishment based on binary choice, heaven versus hell. After writing down notes for about an hour, I had the following idea. You can't map an ethical continuum or the age of accountability continuum into a binary result, heaven versus hell, without the meaning of ethics and accountability being lost. The reason is that 2 points just on either side of a demarcation point are nearly identical with respect to their properties. Hence, the meaning is lost. Take age of accountability. Suppose that for some person the age is 5 and that a point in time is selected as being the point at which the person becomes 5 years old. Well, the person does not change perceptibly a minute before turning 5 as compared to a minute after turning 5. So the concept that they are not accountable before the point, but are accountable after the point, is arbitrary, implying that the concept of accountability as a determinant of punishment is meaningless. Instead, the determination becomes arbitrary. The implication is that the concept that people are rewarded in terms of heaven versus hell after death is meaningless in terms of ethics and accountability. Thus, if hell and heaven are implemented as in tradition, they are the result of arbitrary judgments. What is needed for ethics and responsibility to retain meaning is to map an ethical or accountability continuum into a respective continuum, maintaining the concept of linear function, proportionality, as much as possible. I find this insight quite invigorating and exciting, confirming that rationality can produce insight. More is stated in my handwritten notes. I was stunned that day that I had proven that this central tenet of Christianity, the concept of dichotomous afterlife, is irrational, such that God cannot rationally implement it. That is, I had proven that there is no rational criterion by which God could partition the set of all people into 2 categories, those who should be sent to hell and those who should be sent to heaven. Until that morning, I had never dreamed that you could prove anything about afterlife. I thought that it was beyond the reach of human reason. I thought that you had to be told about it through divine revelation, and then as a result of divine revelation, there was nothing you could do to question it. God had to tell you about afterlife, and you just had to accept it. As I say, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. This was a revolutionary moment for me in my intellectual development in general, and in my understanding of religion in particular. Having discovered that the idea of dichotomous afterlife is irrational, I wanted to reread the Gospels to see exactly what Jesus said about heaven versus hell, and about salvation from hell. What exactly did Jesus teach? Here again I was stunned. I began reading the Gospels, and I discovered that in the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the message of Jesus is not salvation by grace, but salvation by works. More precisely, except for a few anomalous statements, the message of Jesus is not salvation by grace, but salvation by works. I couldn't believe it. I had been reading the Bible all my life. And now for the first time I discovered that in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus doesn't teach salvation by grace, but salvation by works. I was utterly amazed. Furthermore, in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus is not God incarnate. He is merely a Son of God, which is an attribution that was commonly made of any great person of the time, especially of rulers. I could deduce then that the ideas of salvation by grace and divine incarnation had come from Paul's teaching, in that the Gospel of John was a portrayal of Jesus from this point of view. Having made these discoveries, I could deduce that the Christian Church had collected the respective books together and it eventually imposed upon Mark, Matthew, and Luke an interpretation in terms of salvation by grace and divine incarnation. That is, the teaching of Paul was taken as dominant, as expressed in Paul's letters and the Gospel of John, and Mark, Matthew, and Luke were interpreted in terms of Paul's teaching. May I illustrate what I'm talking about? You recall that I read the parable of the Compassionate Samaritan in the video on the meaning of life. I'd like to read the context for the parable once again. This is from Luke chapter 10 in the New Living Translation. One day an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what must I do to receive eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" The man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus told him, "Right, do this and you will live." The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Well, Jesus then tells the parable. Now, put yourself in the place of the bystanders who believe in the Pharisaic idea of dichotomous afterlife. They are keenly interested in what Jesus is saying because they are desperately concerned in knowing how to obtain assurance of going to heaven. As any Christian knows today, this is the perfect opportunity for presenting the idea of salvation by grace. But instead, Jesus confirms the idea of salvation by works. The expert in religious law expresses the idea of salvation by works, and Jesus confirms his position. Here you are standing to the side, and you hear Jesus clearly affirm salvation by works. Furthermore, Jesus tells a shocking parable that you'll never forget for the rest of your life. In this parable, Jesus insults the Jewish religious leaders by portraying them as uncaring and lacking virtue, while Jesus portrays an infidel Samaritan as the exemplar of compassion and virtue. Jesus portrays an infidel Samaritan as the exemplar of a person who will receive eternal life. This is one parable that you're not going to forget. Now, as a bystander, as you head home, what have you learned from Jesus about how to obtain eternal life? I invite you to think concretely about this. You are seriously worried about ending up in hell, and you've just heard a story about an infidel Samaritan who saves the life of a Jew, and this Samaritan is presented by Jesus as the exemplar of a person who will receive eternal life. You desperately want to obtain assurance of going to heaven, and you've just heard this story about the Samaritan. As you're trudging home, are you saying to yourself, "Well, that was a heartening story, because now I know how to get to heaven"? Is that what you would be thinking? I invite you to pause the video at the next slide and think seriously about what you'd be thinking if you were trudging home after hearing Jesus tell the story. I conclude that as you head home, two ideas will be riveted in your mind. The first idea is that salvation is by works. This came through quite clearly, and it is consistent with Judaism. The second idea is more subtle and is disturbing. The second idea is that there is no discrete definition of what constitutes adequate works for salvation. In other words, Jesus affirms that salvation is by works, but he presents an open-ended call to live by the highest standards of personal ethics and altruism. And an open-ended call provides no assurance of salvation. If we continue reading the New Testament, we discover that it is Paul who provides assurance of salvation using the concept of salvation by grace. By the way, in my book I devote several pages just to analyzing the rationality of the concepts of salvation by works and salvation by grace. If you're interested in the topic, I think that you'll find the results of that analysis fascinating.